All right, people, we're back with another episode of Talkin' Thrones, another season premiere. We got the premiere of season 5 that we're talking about tonight. I'm on vacation, but of course that will not stop myself from podcasting because I never stop podcasting. Season 5, episode 1, The Wars to Come. We're past the halfway point. We're officially kind of in the wrap-up phase now, Pat. You know, we've only got, after we're done with this season, we've only got 3 more seasons left of the show. You got anything to say, Pat, before we get started?
Yeah, I think, Dom, maybe you and the Talking TV family here that's listening to, Talking Thrones will agree with me that the sloppiness is yet to come, right? Isn't that the name of the episode?
Yet to come, indeed. The wars to come. Yes, indeed. But like I said, there's still a little bit of, just a little bit. We're starting to fall apart at the scene, but just a little bit of cohesiveness left here. We'll get into all of that and more on tonight's episode of Talking Thrones. All right, Pat, season 5, we've made it. This is an interesting one because I think this is the only season that really still to this day has me in a conundrum. Like, I've gotten my thoughts pretty solidified on all the seasons now, both based off of my first couple times watching the show and the rewatch now. You know, I've come around, my thoughts on certain seasons have changed. Other seasons, they've remained the same. But season 5 is always an interesting beast because I don't think there's any other season of the show where that simultaneously has some of the most awesome moments of the entire show and also some of the absolute worst, because this is famously the season that finally gives us Hardhome. We finally get the giant White Walker attack. Everything that's going on with the Night's Watch is awesome. We get the Sons of the Harpy this season in Meereen. We get Cersei's Walk of Penance, which is also awesome. But some might argue that this is really where the problems with the show started to rear their ugly head. It felt like, again, there was a lot of consolidation of some of the storylines in the book. This is famously the last season that is based off of the books. A lot of some ancillary characters and antagonists that some felt didn't really have their just desserts in order to really exercise their thoughts process. I don't know. What were your thoughts once we got to this phase of the show, Pat?
I'm looking forward to seeing this season again. For the most part, I remember enjoying it. Hardhome, definitely one of my favorite episodes. I think it's really the first moment where the White Walkers show their full strength. And, it's been teased, for 4 seasons now, and it's ready for that shoe to drop for us, the audience, to see the full threat that we're up against. And, it's 4 seasons of all this sort of Game of Thrones of backstabbing and war and all this, and it's a mess. It's a complete and utter mess, and now we have this threat to everybody, and there's no chance that any of these folks, whether it be Cersei or Dorne or basically Daenerys over there in Essos, that are going to rally in time to stop the White Walkers. Like, I think it really sets up that tone of like, humanity is screwed. And I think it does that pretty well. And there's a lot of other, like you said, moments within this season that really, don't play well. And, it's regrettable. But I would say there's a couple of moments, where the show falls flat or, definitely upsets some of the viewers.
Yeah, like just a point of reference, because you just made me remember. I'm like, oh, great, this is also the season where we get Dorne. Awesome. But this is also
yeah, it's great until they basically sweep it under the rug.
Until they're just like, oh yeah, we're gonna forget about that. No, but if there's one thing that this episode kind of sets up, that kind of is an overarching theme for this season that we see next season kind of, again, brush under the rug, which I'll get to next season, where I don't think I'll say this much, is that if season 5 is the season that I've spent this long, like, it's been 7 years since this season aired. I was a senior in high school when this season aired. This was the first season this was the second season that I was watching the show week to week. I was finally caught up. I was fully enmeshed into it. I knew this was going to be the last season they were basing off the books. I remember in the press release, Benioff and Weiss saying that they were going to take the events that occurred across both A Feast for Crows and A Dance for Dragons and merge them into one season. I personally was not in favor of that, but I was still at that point very young and naive and interested to see what they were going to do with it. Needless to say, the results spoke for themselves, but But I will say this, that for season 6, I don't think I've ever had a faster turnaround on a season of television where it's so awesome in the moment, but then after the fact, I'm like, oh wow, no, there were a lot of problems in that season of just them brushing a lot of the storylines under the rug. But the interesting thing about this season that I think it does right, as far as this, you could tell there's still a lot of stuff that's being pulled from Martin's source material here that still does make this season better than a lot of other seasons of television, is that I think this episode in particular sets up really well two things. One, the fact that kind of no matter, at this point, all the characters are kind of coming to some terms of the fact that no matter what they do, the realm and humanity is always going to be screwed up in some sense. You know, we spent the last couple of seasons showing like the miserable effects that the higher ups and their constant warring would have on the common folk. And now we almost kind of see like a little bit of like the common folks getting back at the higher ups, you know, in multiple different forms. You see the Sparrows and their slow infestation that's going to start in King's Landing this season, and Cersei's very
it's already started.
It's already started. You see the Sons of the Harpy, and they're starting to make their moves in Meereen. You all around, it seems to be all about how the people, the lower borns and the commoners have finally just had enough with the higher ups, and they want to do something about it. And well, I mean, I'll save it for season 6 as far as how they handle that, but all of that setup for this season, I think, is handled very, very well. And I think that's the stuff that really allows this season to still stand out as being better than some of the more problematic seasons. But I don't know. What's your take on that?
Oh, listen, I just want to go and talk about the Sparrows right away because they lay it. It's like a simple layup in this episode, which basically Cersei is told, oh, if Tywin was alive, he would never let the Sparrows into the capital city. And that's it. That's like the only line we really get. Obviously, we get, Cersei's cousin there, who she had a relationship with.
The affair with Lancel.
Lancel. So, but basically, the fact is, we get a little tease of the Sparrows in this first episode. And I think you're right. You know, it's... You said before we were on the air that it's essentially these other characters that are coming in, like the Sparrows, the what is it, Daenerys, the Sons of the Harpy, and whatnot. And it's like now these main characters have their own sort of baggage that they're dealing with, and we're being introduced to them early on in this first episode.
100%. Absolutely. The other thing also that I'll say before we actually get into the episode and start breaking down these plot lines, as far as, this episode, a lot of people start talking about, the wars to come, the conflicts to come. It's obviously in the title of the episode, the wars to come. If last season was all about kind of wrapping up a lot of like kind of the hanging threads that had been looming since season 1, then this season is definitely teeing us up for the next couple of conflicts that are going to come, both from the immediate antagonists that we meet in this season, as well as some of the more looming, overwhelming threats that are going to carry us through all the way to the end of the show. Obviously, again, this, like you said, this is the Hardhome season. This is where we get the White Walkers and their full display of their strength. I mean, I'll get to that in a minute, like when we get to it, because I definitely have a feeling that they kind of shot themselves in the foot as far as just, the awestruck, unbelievable, cinematography that Miguel Sapochnik brings to that. The other thing too about this season is the directors that Benioff and Weiss brought in for this season are the directors that you see kind of carrying them through to the end of the show. Michael Slovis directs this episode of the next one, and these are the only 2 episodes that he directs, but the next 3 directors that they bring in for this season, Mark Mylod, Jeremy Podeswa, and Miguel Sapochnik, would all direct episodes going all the way through to the last season. This is also famously the season that brought back David Nutter, who directed the Reigns of Castamere, the famous Red Wedding sequence, in order to do the Dragonpit sequence at the end of this episode, because it all ties into the fact that this is the season where they really upped the production. I mean, they'd slowly been upping it really since season 3, but this is the season where you're just like, God damn, they had really fully achieved like a cinematic level of storytelling for television in a way that really no TV show had ever done before, just from a visual aesthetic.
Yeah, I would say season 4 is really the first one where it seems like they upped the value. I think there's a big distinction between, the first 3 seasons and season 4. But I think in terms of going full out in terms of war sequences and doing sustained, basically battles that are just jaw dropping. They put a little extra money, but I think last season, season 4 is where they really, up the gear, up the process of filming. And then this semester, or not semester, geez, I'm stuck in my day job, but, basically this season, it's like they decide to go all in on these war sequences, and it just pays off. Like Hardhome is essentially one of my favorite episodes, and I think it's because that's when you have all the chips on the table. It's finally the moment where the White Walkers show their true selves.
100%. Yeah, but let's get into this episode. Season 5, Episode 1, the premiere, The Wars to Come. This is a really good episode. I will say this. Of all the episodes of Season 5 that I have problems with, this is one of the ones that I do not have that many problems with, because I think it does an excellent job of setting up all the major conflicts that we're going to see this season really, really well. I think that although there are still a few problematic things that do get set up in this episode, we don't know about them yet, and I think they're still really well handled as far as how they proceed from the storylines from the last episode. I think it also, again, as far as kind of I think the other thing that this episode does a really good job of, as far as is breaking down, again, we were following so many storylines, so many different characters over the last couple seasons, that this season, I think, is the beginning where we really start to streamline and kind of bring us back to the main 3 storylines that we kind of started out the show with, which is, of course, King's Landing, The Wall, and Across the Narrow Sea with Daenerys, as far as Meereen goes, and pretty much everyone else is kind of streamlined, sidelined, supporting. Tyrion is kind of back to being a supporting character. We don't spend that much time in the Vale. Like, it really is around Jon, Cersei, and Daenerys, who are pretty much established at this point to be the 3 characters that are going to carry us through to the rest of the show. And we pick up with a really interesting opening sequence, which is we get a flashback of young Cersei, which is a sequence that was only told to us in the books, but is actually presented, I think, really, really well here, which is the sequence, of course, of young Cersei visiting Maggie the Frog when she was a little girl, and Maggie the Frog famously telling her the prophecy that we in the books knew about because it had been haunting Cersei, since she was a little girl. But now we actually see it play out in real time, and we now kind of understand. It gives us a lot of context about Cersei as a character, where she had this prophecy from this witch that was living on her lands as a little girl. She was very full of herself as the daughter of the richest man in Westeros. She was going to marry Rhaegar Targaryen, famously, before Rhaegar married Elia Martell, Oberyn's sister, and she was just trying to flex a little bit as this soon-to-be queen. And Maggie the Frog tells her this prophecy that, for the most part, has all come true, where she's not going to marry the prince at the time, Rhaegar. She's going to marry the king, obviously, who would come to, become Robert Baratheon. She said, you and the king won't have any children. The king will have 20. You'll only have 3. Gold will be their crowns, and gold will be their shrouds. And it brings up this very interesting idea, one of a few interesting ideas that, unfortunately, Benioff and Weiss kind of dropped the ball on, which is this idea of prophecy and how we interpret prophecy versus what it actually comes to mean. And kind of, I think one of the more underrated aspects is kind of the misinterpretation of prophecies by a lot of people. You see this obviously with Melisandre as well, but I feel like this is the season that really solidifies it as well.
Yeah, listen, this flashback scene, I hated it. I'm just gonna go rain on your parade. But no, it's like every time it gets to season 5, the first episode, I hit the button like I'm gonna watch Game of Thrones. And then all of a sudden, this other show comes on, and I'm like, who are these, little girls running in the woods? And, what is this, Hansel and Gretel? Like, they're bringing back Grimm's fairy tales. So like, basically, it just like takes me right out of it. And then, yeah, we get the prophecy, and, I agree with you that, there is a certain, magic to the world that this scene brings. But, we never really saw it, and we never really revisited it again. So, for me, this sequence is sort of like, it's good. It's well shot. It's kind of, lets you into the mindset of Cersei at the beginning of the season, and basically that there's more in store for her going forward. It really is just sort of, I think, utilized here in this season as a way of setting up, just more tragedy to come for the character. And, there's nothing really to read into it, in my opinion. Obviously it sounds like, from what you said, there's more to it in the books, and it kind of weighs on her a little more. But in this show, it's kind of one and done. And then it just sort of kickstarts the season. And I can almost just deal without it. Let's
Well,
just
the whole thing about it is that
move on.
Cersei, the thing that's established by both the flashback in the show and both the reveal of the flashback in the books, or at least how we see it presented with Cersei's inner monologue, because famously this is also Feast for Crows is the first book that we get Cersei as a focus character, where we had not gotten her as a focus character beforehand, is that it's supposed to give us context as far as her decision-making process goes. Her kind of the motivation behind her protective nature of her children, why she's kind of, her motivation towards actually wanting to grasp at this power as well. It's interesting because we've seen kind of Jon and Daenerys' motivation factors up until this point, but we really haven't gotten that sort of insight within Cersei. And considering the fact that a lot of the rest of the action that's going to happen over the next couple of seasons in King's Landing seems to revolve much more so around Cersei than a few of the other characters in a way that it really didn't beforehand, I find it really interesting that we get this kind of context because it gives us so much more introspection into her as a character that we really didn't have before, if anything. Before, we knew her as a mother, we knew her as this figure that would obviously do anything for her children, but also, we knew she had this incestuous relationship with her brother, but this kind of helps make us understand, why she has always grasped for that sense of power, because she constantly feels like her entire life has never been in her control, if that makes sense. So it just adds a little bit more context.
For me, what I think would work in this season is if, Tywin dies at the end of last season. Obviously, she's reflecting back on life and, sort of mourning her father. Really also is upset with the position that they're in because, to the most part, they all the Lannister kids kind of hid behind Tywin as this tyrant, as the force to be reckoned with, that's really giving them the power. And they just sort of enjoyed, what was given to them. And now that he's gone, they got to really deal with it. So, right. I would almost like to see how, like in season 5, really Tywin's death impacting Cersei, having her reflect back on her childhood and this prophecy, and really just have other moments where she's reflecting back and maybe show a couple other flashbacks throughout the season, really to define the character. I think you're right. It giving us a little more insight into who she is, is definitely welcomed. But this is like a one and done scene. It's right here at the beginning of the season. And then, the show just sort of continues, and doesn't really, in my opinion, dive too deep into her past history, to inform us of, what's going on. It's just this one scene, take it or leave it. And then they're sort of done with that sort of idea of, bringing us into or how her past impacted her.
Well, it's interesting because the other thing, too, that this season, that specifically this episode that's kind of an over-looming threat, is just how much Tywin's death affects everyone else. You hear Kevin talk about it. You hear Cersei talk about it when she kind of throws it back at Jaime when they're in the Sept, visiting Tywin. You hear Stannis talk about it at the wall. Is the fact that Tywin Lannister, at the end of the day, was a terrible father, but a crucially important figure in the role of Westeros. And now that he's gone, it's like everyone is vying for a seat because everyone and their mother kind of knew that Tywin was the real source of power amongst the Lannisters, despite Davos' claims last season to the Iron Bank. And now that that's the case, everyone is kind of coming at them, and that's something that Jaime tries to make Cersei aware of. But while in the Great Set, but that's the other thing too that's established, that Cersei is, and ultimately her fatal flaw is, Cersei ultimately believes in herself more than anything else, and ultimately cannot get past, and ultimately believes that she knows more than anyone else. It's like exactly what Tywin said to her a couple seasons ago, which is that she thinks that she's a lot smarter than she really is. When you see that reflect in her actions throughout the season with her attempts to manipulate the Sparrows, where she's having this conversation with Jaime. Jaime's trying to warn her about some very real threats that are going to happen, which is that everyone outside, everyone, the Sparrows, the Dornish, because even though we don't see them in this episode, we know that that Elia is still very much angry about Oberyn's death and is planning some sort of revenge. He knows he's trying to rightfully so warn her that everyone is going to try and come for this seat of power that Tywin has left in his wake. And all that she's throwing back at him is the fact that he let Tyrion go, and the fact that even though Tyrion killed him on purpose, Jaime killed him on accident. She just cannot get past her own self. And you kind of see that reflected as well later on in the sequence with Lancel, where Lancel is providing a very real threat. She should be very terrified that he's back in the capital,
Well, she should be terrified in general because, she's warned 100%, the Sparrows would never set foot in the city if Tywin was still alive. Like, there's a reason why he kept them away. and because he would have just murdered them. He would have just, like, if they came in, he would have ordered the troops to kill them. And she doesn't even recognize that that's what's being said to her at that moment. Obviously she's in grief and dealing with other problems. But the fact is that this storyline evolves. Like, she's the one that really empowers them during the course of the season, and it leads to her being tragically held prisoner by the Sparrows. So, like, it's one of those things, like, they're peppering it in there right now. But this is going to be her first major lesson about, ruling in Tywin's stead, or at least, being the power behind the Lannisters, is that, there's certain decisions you have to make. There's certain, known knowns, like the Sparrows are bad news. And, she is going to learn it the hard way. That's what she's going to pay the iron price, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah. And the other thing, too, also that I want to talk about in King's Landing is as well the whole Loras situation, the Loras Marjorie situation. Because to me, even though it's a quick, brief scene, and we get the inkling that even though Tywin is dead, and even though her marriage to Loras is most definitely off now that Tywin is not there to force her, Marjorie knows that Cersei is very much still a threat. But to me, this is the beginning of Loras' downfall, because now that Loras kind of, knows that the marriage is not happening, he's kind of just slacked off. He's just sleeping around, whatever. He's like, who cares? Everybody knows it. To me, like you keep saying since the beginning, this is the beginning of Loras kind of giving up on the game. And we see that come back to bite him in the worst way possible over the next couple seasons when the Sparrows come for him, because as we know, if there's one thing that religious fanatics are not a fan of, it is, and I don't think this is too much of a grasp to say this, consider the fact that we saw this all the time in history. It's that for the longest time in history, homosexuality was regarded as a heavy sin by the religious fanatics of the world. So definitely very comparative to the real world aspects there.
Yeah, I think it's good that they set it up here early on. Like they kind of pepper in where the Sparrow storyline is going to go. It's kind of fully set up in this first episode. Loras, again, he's not playing the game, and he basically just wants to enjoy life, be who he is. He doesn't want to be held, in the chains of tradition or whatever it is, like he was going to be, like, being forced to marry Cersei. So it's just pretty much what everybody wants. But unfortunately in this world, anytime that you really sort of, branch out from what you're expected to do, that's when you're putting your head on the chopping block. And, I know a lot of people, when I was watching this with groups of friends, that they didn't like the Loras storyline, that it was pretty much low hanging fruit to have the religious fanatics go after him and whatnot. Too simple, I mean, it's not. It's right. They don't really. To a certain degree, he's now going to sort of take a backseat and not be a predominant character, and he's just going to be sort of targeted, and Loras, for the most part in the first 4 seasons, does have pretty much enough of a significant role to play, and now he's kind of marginalized in this season for sure.
Well, what I'll give him this is I definitely think that it's crazy, because as much as I criticize Benioff and Weiss for deviating from the books, I think did them a little bit of a service in one sense, where at the very least they give him something to do in the show, as opposed to where in the books it's literally just Cersei just sends him on a suicide mission to retake Dragonstone in Stannis' absence, and he's basically on his deathbed the last that we hear about him, so I don't necessarily know what better fate is, but this is definitely the point where they started to run out of ideas, and we're trying to like move Loras Tyrell off the chessboard, and unfortunately Marjorie with him, even though Marjorie still had a lot to contribute as well. So then we move over to Pentos real quick. Quick scene. Like I said, Tyrion takes a drastic backseat this season after being such a crucial part of the action for the previous 3 seasons.
He has to find his place, He
has to find his place again. He also apparently has to find his legs, too, because did you see him moving his legs after? I mean, God only knows how long he'd be stuck in that crate for. He can barely move them. Good Lord.
Well, I don't know. It depends on how big the narrow sea is, a couple
I assume
months.
It's roughly probably like the size of the Atlantic, so...
other than a couple months,
Yeah.
But the main thing is, in that sequence, it's great because we get the point of view shot from inside the crate. It's being carried. set down on the ground. We see Tyrion's like fingers at the breath holes, and essentially it's a really cool sequence when Varys kind of like gets him out of the crate. Of course, once he's out of the crate, he's like, why the hell was I in there the whole entire time? Right. Surely we could
let me out. Really?
Yeah, exactly. And basically Varys, puts it bluntly. It's like, hey, you get caught, I get caught. So to put it blunt, we gotta, I had to keep it on the down low.
Yeah.
And Tyrion is, basically immediately goes to drinking. He's going to drink himself to death. That's his plan. He's lost everything. He doesn't really have anything to live for. And Varys and him have a conversation about what he can become now that he's lost his position in the world. And, the fact is you could be someone that advises Daenerys.
Yeah.
And, that's the ultimately sort of the linchpin of this sequence. And he's skeptical. He just basically says, can I drink myself to death on the way to Meereen?
Yeah.
And so, he's willing to make the journey because he has nothing better to do.
Right.
But he's still skeptical that, this is a better plan than just grabbing a couple bottles of wine and, having his liver go to town.
Down the hatch. Yeah. I already made my problems as far as where they were chose to continue Tyrion's arc after the events of season 4. I made that very clear last episode, so I won't go too much into depth this episode. What I will say is that it's a couple notable differences here from the books. It's in the books of Tyrion's meeting with Illyrio, not with Varys. The fact that we don't see Illyrio again in any way, shape, or form. In the books, the fact that, again, Benioff Weiss really trying to cut and scale back on the ancillary characters because we're in wrap-up phase. But the way that Varys almost tries to make it seem like, and that's the other thing too also that I'm not a fan of, is the fact that in the books, the fact that it's Illyrio explaining it to Tyrion, not Varys, it still allows a lot of the mystery to surround Varys' character, which continues to make him interesting, even though he doesn't play as big a part in these two books. Here, it just, I don't know, there's just something really unsatisfying about them kind of pulling the wool back from Varys and just showing, oh yeah, I've been supporting the Targaryen regime the entire time. Like, it was hinted at beforehand, but it was never really explicitly made clear. And now that it has, I don't know, like I said, in addition to Tyrion being a rather uninteresting character for the next 4 seasons, it also really takes a lot away from Varys, especially since after Tyrion's kidnapped by Jorah in a couple episodes, Varys just disappears until next episode, and then Varys just seems to kind of Varys just turns into a really a plot device character as far as just magically making things happen for the sake of things happening, and doesn't really become an interesting character again until the next 2 seasons. But I don't know. I see all the points are there. Everything's brought up as far as, okay, we're going to go to Daenerys. I've secretly been supporting her this entire time. I've been working behind the scenes to ensure that Robert Baratheon doesn't work. A lot of people criticize Varys in the last couple of seasons, but for me, I feel like I'm like, look, if you're going to criticize Varys, the criticisms start here, because it's like, okay, couple things. One, if you wanted to unseat Robert Baratheon, why didn't you just kill him at any point, or like engineer a plot to have him killed? Secondly, if the plot was to have Robert Baratheon killed, why? You knew that the Lannisters were going to take charge, and why support them for as long as you did? It's like the problem is that Varys' plotline, at least the way that it's presented here, it completely undermines, to me, what was so interesting about him as a character for the first 4 seasons, which is that you never really knew where his loyalties lied. And in the books, they managed to toe that line because, obviously, they have the Aegon Targaryen character come in, which may also hint to the Blackfire Rebellion as well throughout the history, as well as potentially sparking a Targaryen civil war. And it almost seems like he's using Tyrion deliberately as a means in order to attempt to instigate that war, in order to see who can prove themselves as the better ruler. But here, it's just like, nope, I'm just a Targaryen supporter, And it's the fact of removing kind of the gray veil there kind of, to me, takes away just so much of the interesting stuff there. I probably just threw a bunch of shit at the wall that you probably have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah, right no. No, it's, I can see what you're saying in terms of, having Varys and keeping his motivations sort of from the reader and building that suspense. But in the show, the context of the show, there's no way for them to really do that.
Right.
Because...
And it comes, of course, from their decision to ultimately completely cut the Aegon Targaryen storyline and the Jon Connington storyline completely from this entire show.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also other things, it just, Varys and Tyrion, because they've lost their position in Westeros, and now they're making this journey. it's a little bit of a long road. Like for them to get into Daenerys's court is going to take a minute, and then for them to really gain her trust. So it's like it's kind of like
I don't know. They do it pretty quickly when they get there, or at least Tyrion does.
But it's almost like what their goal is to get back at basically the Lannisters, that Tyrion's family. It's a really long path. It's like they get there, they get in her graces, and then they have to basically they're spinning the plate with Daenerys, and she's doing her Essos thing, and then eventually towards the later seasons, that's when Daenerys finally comes over to Westeros. So it's they're sort of on the back burner. Like I don't think what they're looking for, which is to make an impact in Westeros, they never really deal with that again until the later seasons. So it's a very slow burn for them to get what they want. And there's really, they just sort of get integrated into Daenerys' storyline. Right. So there's not much of their motivations on the table for the next couple seasons. And I think that's what kind of, puts them on the back burner as ancillary characters.
Which is so disappointing because for the majority of the show's run, those two were two of the most interesting characters. It was so much fun watching their back and forth, because again, like because you love Tyrion so much because of how awesome and interesting of a character he was. And, Varys was such a mysterious character. You never knew where his loyalties lie, but you always kind of wanted him to root for Tyrion because it just, based on common sense of what the show was telling you, it just seemed like Tyrion always was the right person for the job. And it's just, I don't know. It's just, the more and more I think about it, the more I realize that it's like, man, I really wish that like they could have done a better job with this.
I feel like there could have been different storylines. Like, obviously, where the books, the direction they were headed and essentially what people expect George R.R. Martin to continue the stories. It might have been better to have like, Tyrion and Varys get there, establish themselves, and then start doing like plots.
Right. Which is essentially what happens, only minus Varys. So in order to basically break it down exactly what happens, so Varys is nowhere near. Varys is still kind of on the back burner. Nobody knows where he is for the majority of these books. He's literally not seen until the end of A Dance with Dragons. Nobody knows where he is. Tyrion meets up with Illyrio. Illyrio sends him on the ship that's going towards Daenerys. And the ship, he realizes that two of the crew members are, one of them is Aegon Targaryen, who is revealed to be Rhaegar's surviving son. And his guardian, who's revealed to be Jon Connington, who was previously, one of Aerys Targaryen's, Mad King Aerys Targaryen's many hands of the king, who was Rhaegar Targaryen's best friend, and so supposedly spirited Aegon Targaryen away from the capital, and was protecting him and raising him up until this point. And so Tyrion, when he finds out that they're heading towards Daenerys because he wants to potentially marry his cousin, Tyrion says that's a terrible idea. You should try and impress her by going and conquering some lands in Westeros in order to, gain her favor by showing her that you're capable as a warlord. Then he gets kidnapped by Jorah. Then he goes on the different trip to Meereen. And so the whole thing that's established there is this kind of back and forth of where it almost feels like Varys and Illyrio almost intentionally planted Tyrion there in order to almost instigate this back and forth Targaryen rivalry, because there's also the conspiracy theory that Aegon in the books may not even necessarily be Aegon Targaryen, and that he may actually be a Blackfire, which that goes into a whole different thing with the Targaryen legacy. But like I said, it's a lot of stuff, but like the way that, like I said, it builds into what I was saying last season about how they seem to be engineering Tyrion as being this linchpin tool, heel turn, like just wanted to cause destruction for destruction's sake, and almost where he becomes a little bit self-aware of it, versus here, it's like, okay, he just becomes another plot device that gets thrown from destination to destination to destination just to do stuff, and he just becomes and he just gets integrated into the Daenerys storyline at the behest of his own really interesting characteristics, and it would have been one thing to me if the show had really done something interesting with their own individual plot line, but as we see, the results speak for themselves. So speaking of Daenerys, let's get back to an actually interesting plot line here, which is the beginning of the Sons of the Harpy arc, which, again, fantastic introduction. I think it's actually really, really interesting and really smart how they kind of show...
Well, they rip down the statue, right? That's scene one.
Right, but then you see, the Unsullied, they're going to the brothels, and, you have Missandei talking with Grey Worm after the Unsullied member is killed, whereas,
I thought they actually changed Grey Worm's actor for a second. Here's season 5.
You're like, who is that?
No, obviously the
You're like, that's not
Unsullied.
Jacob Anderson.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I don't know. It's just the way that they introduced it. They've been changing actors. They
Yeah.
changed the Three-Eye Raven this
Yep, they
season,
changed
right? Or
Beric.
next season.
They changed Beric. They changed Dario last season. What's it called? And the next season they changed the Three-Eyed Raven. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, let's just say like after a year of basically between seasons, if you're watching this on a regular basis and all of a sudden you comes back, you're like, did they change actors again? So I feel like, the show has kind of put me on edge of like, is that possible that they did that? So the original first time I watched this, I was like, I thought they might have changed actors. I'm like, are they killing Grey Worm right now? But obviously that's not the case. It's just one of his fellow Unsullied brothers, and basically, yeah, they've found a way to live in the city. And one of the things that they, I guess, enjoy is going to the brothels and getting that intimacy, sort of
And I
being
love how
sung
that,
to
that
sleep,
just
so to
goes
speak.
exactly. That just goes into the
Etc.
psychology of the Unsullied. The fact that they were bred as warriors literally from the minute that they were boys, so they never had a chance to develop that sense of intimacy. And so the fact that they're kind of going to the brothel in order to kind of get that, I think is a really, really interesting story turn. And if anything, it makes the twist when the Sons of the Harpy come up and slices his throat even more like just unsettling when that happens. And because it shows a vulnerability to Daenerys and really all of her soldiers that really never had, because the whole thing about Daenerys is she's developed this rapport with her soldiers that is unlike most other warlords. Most other warlords, they gain her through like this sort of, respect, this camaraderie, or in the sense that they just buy them out if they're mercenaries. But Daenerys has almost developed like this, this matronly relationship with all of her soldiers because she's single-handedly freed them. She freed the Unsullied from slavery. She freed all the slaves from Yunkai and the gladiators in Meereen and everything, So she feels
I also feel like this sequence is missing sort of that, connection, right, between Daenerys and this particular Unsullied. Like, that's probably one of the reasons why you're thinking, at least on first watch, I was willing to believe they changed actors, is because, this is one of those like moments where it's stunning. And way of elevating it and making it a little more impactful is if it's a character that you know and love, or at least have some familiarity with and understand, like, Daenerys is going to take it to heart. So, if they had maybe set up another Unsullied, a little more and had a couple interactions with Daenerys, like maybe, maybe Grey Worm is not the only one to sort of be heroic on the battlefield and whatnot throughout the previous seasons. Like, and then this is that sort of moment where they get the surprise, knife to the throat. I think that would have really elevated the sequence a little more. And then, it's like, yeah, the Sons of the Harpy, this is a real threat. This is a big thing that she's going to have to deal with going forward.
Absolutely. And the other major development that comes from this sequence, obviously, is Dario and Hizar returning back from Yunkai. And again, it's like, oh, everything went perfectly according to plan. The slave masters, they will happily restore the slaves to free citizens if you reopen the fighting pits. And I'm like, okay, first of all, the fact that she still trusts the slave masters is kind of hilarious in general, considering that they reconquered the city like the minute that she took it back, and now she's like, rewarding them with some good faith in general, I think is hilarious. But also, this does bring up an interesting point as far as her reopening the fighting pits, which is this idea of, and like that tackles into some interesting ideas, but this is another thing that I think is like kind of half-baked, and they didn't really fully develop it as well as they should from the books, which is, again, in the books, it's a sense of where the Sons of the Harpy start to rear their ugly heads at the exact same time that there's a plague going around the city. So it's the fact that Daenerys is trying to learn as a ruler, but she's under an incredible amount of stress. So she opens the fighting pits almost as a means of necessity, as opposed to it being offered to her as like this, this solution to this peaceful resolution, as this political compromise that she's forced to make. But I will say this, though, that Dario does save this sequence by kind of explaining, as he does in great detail, kind of, again, like the commoner's perspective, which is something that Daenerys seems to be lacking so much. This idea that even though Yeah, he was sold into slavery by his mother at 12, and he was in the fighting pits. It was a sense of where kind of it allowed him to prove himself through skill alone. And as a result, he was able to almost ascend the social hierarchy. And I think the way that he explains that to Daenerys is done, I think, in a really, really exceptional manner as well. And it's all tied together, of course, with her going to visit the dragons again in the pit, who are growing ever larger as well. And they
yeah, I'm just gonna say, I think time to develop these storylines they're running out of it.
They really are.
A lot of it, like when we watch these scenes and they're great scenes. I agree with you on that. When Dario's explaining things, it's clear, it's concise, it sets up the plot point. But it's almost like we got to set up this in this sequence and then we got to move on.
Right.
The next episode is going to be completely different. So it's one of those things where, they have a lot going on in the series at this point. There's a lot of characters. There's a lot yet to come. And, essentially, I guess you're starting, to see that things are being set up really quickly, getting straight to the point. Because there's bigger moments that they want to hit and they want to focus on.
Yes.
And, it's these are kind of ancillary, I think, to the most part, maybe some nitpicking by the two of us, but for this is where it's starting, where you're sort of getting this streamlined story and sort of, digging deep into the world. That's come and gone. That whole sort of journey into the world and understanding everything and still being surprised by the world. There's going to be less and less of that as we go forward. So, this might be sort of, the signs of that turning point where, things are, less of a surprise and it's more straight to the point to lead up to the big moments.
Right. And like I said, this kind of built into my point that I was making last episode, which is where the decision to ultimately streamline a lot of storylines that across 2 books. It took Martin 2 books to flesh out all of these storylines that are happening, and ultimately merge them into one. Like I said, we're really at the beginning of a Dance with Dragons right now, where we're tackling both the Dance with Dragons and a Feast for Crows, where the Cersei arc with the Sparrows happens in Feast for Crows versus Tyrion, Jon, and Daenerys and everything that they've got going on. Happens in A Dance with Dragons. So it's the fact that they're ultimately, because they have all these 2 very large books that they're attempting to merge and tell all in one season, they're going to streamline and they're going to skip ultimately a lot of storylines, but also swap out certain storylines for other ones that, again, it's just very baffling in their decision making there. I'll get to that in a little bit, but 2 more storylines to majorly hit here. The Vale, your favorite character, Robin Arryn.
Yeah, Robin is does a great job.
Oh, he can't do anything.
This is a fantastic sequence. Just Sansa, Littlefinger, and what's his name? The knight,
Lord Royce, Jan Royce.
Yeah, Royce. He's basically, they're all watching Robin, and he's just 13. He's has the shield and the sword. He's sort of just flailing his arms a little bit, and he's at least able to use the shield to block the attack. But they're just casually sitting there watching and just I get, a young boy of 13 can learn. And Royce just responds, "Yeah, young men of 13 go fight wars."
He's like my sons had swords in their hands by the time they could walk, essentially. He's
ready to fight
war.
There's no
Littlefinger's
real hope for Robin.
Yeah, there really is. Littlefinger's just trying to make it very clear that it's look, he's only using Robin as a name here. He receives a tiny little letter from one of his aides, and again, this sequence is primarily set up. There's not a whole lot that comes from this. It's the only thing that you could really take away from this more so is Sansa really understanding more and playing into Littlefinger's game, where they're where they leave whatever castle that is, and and Sansa's like, "You told Lord Royce that we were going to the Fingers," and he's like, "I did," and she's like, "Oh, but you're actually going west." It's more so it's more so Sansa thinking that she's on Littlefinger's level, where Littlefinger is still ultimately playing his own game. We also get a quick check in with Brienne and Pod that ultimately amounts to nothing. It's just Brienne clearly is sick of Pod and wants to get rid of him.
Well, she's upset. She thinks this journey's all for nothing. And
which
Pod
in a sense, she's not wrong.
Yeah, and Podrick is basically making logical sense. He's saying everything that is true. and that's something that she doesn't necessarily want to hear right now. But it's the thing that she has to hear. So it is really a good sequence or scene that's thrown in there, just to sort of remind you that the two of them, are on their own journey, and that they're going to be included in this season. We, obviously the mention of maybe Sansa needs your help. That's something that's is planting the seed for where they're going to go. So it's definitely very important, very quick, very, very short. But it just kind of sets them in motion for the season.
100%. Yeah. Now let's get to it though. Let's wrap up this episode, and let's wrap up with to me, my favorite part of this episode and my absolute favorite arc of this entire season, which is the Night's Watch arc. Just to me, every single
when Stannis basically just goes, "Yeah, you got till nightfall, nights come quick,
or he's dead." And but just like everything that happens in this arc across the season is just masterful to me. Like if last season was all about Jon officially coming of age, and this is like Jon starting to inheriting his leadership role, his first real leadership role that he earns is becoming Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. His back and forth with Stannis, his back and forth with Mance Rayder in this episode, and him starting to develop and really cultivate his relationship with the wildlings that's been built up in the last 2 seasons. Just everything that's done here, masterful, from him still kind of taking out a little bit of his wrath on Ollie, the fact that he can't be outwardly mad at Ollie, but he still obviously harbors a big grudge against him for killing Ygritte. Alistair Thorne's comments about the Night's Watch and how young and inexperienced they are. Sam talking about the upcoming election. The Night's Watch, they know the war is over, so they need to start worrying about a new leader. Jon also has his meeting with Stannis, where Stannis, now that Tywin is dead, Stannis thinks that he's got another shot. And I'll get to my problems with Stannis. And while I'm not a fan at all of where they take the Stannis arc at the end of this season, I think Stannis' arc, for the most part, they do a pretty damn good job as far as with the setup of it. With him being at the wall, with him talking and conversing with Jon about the wildlings, being like, look, you've essentially delivered me an army that I can use to essentially take back the throne, where Stannis has kind of refocused his efforts rather intelligently so, I would say, in the sense of where, okay, I tried to launch my attack on the south with the assault on King's Landing. That failed. I tried using Melisandre's weird sorcery thing. Davos kind of unintentionally sabotaged me that. Now I'm here in the north, and now I'm going to focus my efforts on the one of the 7 kingdoms that is larger than the other 7 kingdoms combined, the north, which I think is really smart. He's like, look, Tywin's not here. This is the one region that he couldn't touch even when he was alive. Now that he's dead, the Boltons are essentially defenseless, so I'm going to take it. And he wants the wildlings' help with it. And it's handled a little bit differently than in the books. In the book, Stannis goes from northern house to northern house in order to try to appeal to them rather than getting the wildlings, because he knows he at first attempts to get the wildlings, but he knows that he won't. So it's really interesting how they tackle both Jon and Stannis' arc in the books as opposed to here. But I think it's translated here really well, which is where Stannis is attempting to use Jon's relationship with the wildlings in this episode to his own benefit, while Jon is still just dealing with the trauma that he dealt with from last episode and trying to move past that. But it does result, I think, in one of the most brilliantly written sequences of the entire show, which is Jon's final conversation with Mance that he has after Stannis basically tells him, it's like, look, I know that you have this relationship with the wildlings. You want to, convince Mance to fight for them. What's it called? And if they fight for me, when I've taken Winterfell, they'll have land. They'll be declared citizens of the realm, and they'll have lands to farm. It's a pretty fair offer, honestly, because Stannis does inherently agree with Jon in the sense of where, yeah, they are just people. They were just born on the wrong side of the wall, ultimately. And so it's not a bad plan in concept. And execution, obviously, is a whole different thing, because we are, as Mance clear,
it comes down to what Mance
will not bend for a Southerner.
Yeah, it's what Mance talks about. Like, the idea is that Jon Snow says, hey, you're making a mistake. And Mance replies, but that's the freedom that I've wanted, is to make my own mistakes.
Right.
And that's the thing that the wildlings would be giving up in this case, if they sort of bend the knee and they join Stannis, is that they're going to, basically rely on his word, go off into a war, die, and then hopefully Stannis grants them land and a way of living, but also that freedom, the freedom that they actually want.
Right.
And that's kind of a hard sell, because now they're part of the realm. They're part of this other society. They're obviously still outsiders by any account. So even though they might be favored in the eyes of Stannis, that's not necessarily going to translate into sort of the the way of life that they want for them and their sons and daughters, etc. As time goes on, because once Stannis is gone, like any given Sunday in the Game of Thrones world, it's basically going to be someone that hates you or loves you or whatever. It's who knows who the next leader is and how they're going to treat the wildlings, even if Stannis gives them some property this generation.
Right, 100%. And like you said, it results in the final sequence, obviously, which is them bringing out Mance in order to, essentially, again, get hit. It's a lose-lose either way, because it's either he dies in this sequence or he humiliates himself, and because it's all about a show of strength, where Stannis wants to show that he is ultimately the bigger man than than Mance. It's essentially exactly what happened with Ned, Robert, and Balon Greyjoy back in the day after the failed Greyjoy rebellion, where they essentially forced him to kneel in front of him as a show of strength to show who was ultimately in charge. And Mance will not bend. Mance knows exactly what this is, and Mance will not bend. And he warns Stannis, he's like, look, this is my home for many years, and I wish you good fortune in the wars to come. Ultimately acknowledging that while he does respect Stannis, he still will not bend for him, and so he's ultimately burned alive. Jon can't take it because he's grown too much respect for Mance, and he mercy kills him by shooting an arrow into his heart. Now, here's where, again, this is the point where we really start to begin with more of the deviation, because in the books, famously, Melisandre, this is where, in the books, Melisandre develops some agency really independently of Stannis in this sequence the minute that she sees Jon. But it's interesting where she takes this in the books, where in the books, she chooses to stay at Castle Black along with Jon, while Stannis takes his expedition south in order to begin his conquest of the North. And famously, because she's trying to assist Jon in any way, shape, or form that she can, famously, she actually keeps Mance alive, and through an act of sorcery, magically swaps Mance for the Lord of Bones, and burns the Lord of Bones at Mance's place, and has Mance kind of almost act as like her foot soldier, essentially, in order to like carry out like what she wants, essentially. It's a really interesting thing that, of course, they leave off the table, because it's too much extra story, and they're in wrap-up mode.
It would be too complicated for
way too complicated
for the TV show.
Yeah, to say the least. Sure. Like I said, you start to see where my problems come in, because I like complexities, and the showrunners are like, no, we have to keep this streamlined and as simple as possible because we have an end goal in sight at some point.
No, it only makes sense for the TV show to combine characters, to cut certain storylines that are not core to the ultimate end game. So that's just a fact and reality of translating a written source material from books into sort of the medium of television or films. Things gotta adapt, things gotta change.
Yes, indeed. So, like I said, Jon pulls his act of defiance in front of everyone, and Stannis realizes, okay, so this guy, again, it's so strange, because every time, I don't think I've ever seen a stranger relationship where Jon openly defies Stannis every chance he gets. He mercy kills Mance. He refuses Stannis' offer of becoming Jon Stark, King of the North. He refuses Stannis at every single minute and opportunity, but for some reason, it just continually impresses Stannis over and over and over.
Well, it's it's basically that whole honor thing. Honor in war, and Stannis, I think, gets it more than anybody. Jon is acting just like his father Ned, and so I think that's one of the things that allows them to sort of have this continuing relationship. I think what would have been a better way to end this episode is, obviously they're lighting the fire, and Mance is starting to feel the heat, and then the arrow hits him, and Mance dies relatively quickly, and then it cuts to Jon, and he basically, that's the moment when we realize what he's done. It cuts to credits, but it would have been great if Jon just looked at the camera and said, "Now that's a mic drop," and just cut the credits.
I was waiting for him to put his fingers to his lips and then do that, the Mockingjay sign. I was waiting for him to do that. I was waiting for that to happen ultimately. But
yeah, there's so many ways to.
You made so many Hunger Games comparisons in the last two episodes that I figured I had.
Yeah, there's so many ways to fantasy rebook this ending here. But hey, it was definitely
Benioff and Weiss didn't even
a great way to end this episode.
Oh, for sure, 100%. But hey, Benioff and Weiss apparently didn't even know what they were doing entirely, because they were in film school. They treated this whole show like film school. But hey, good episode though. Really, really good episode. I think a really good job of establishing not only like kind of the threats that they're going to face this season, but also in the next couple of seasons to come. Like they continually emphasize, this is all about the wars to come. This is all about the conflicts that are going to present themselves to these characters, that the characters are going to deal with all the way up until the very episode. But the good and the bad. Like I said, you also see a drastic shift. I always see a very marked shift in story tone and direction between the first 4 seasons versus the last 4. But for this episode, it gets an A+ for me. I'm a big fan of this episode still. Really, really good. And that was it. That is, like I said, we're in the wrap-up phase now, people. Season 5 is beginning. We have 3 more seasons left after this season, and then that is it. So be sure to keep coming back for more episodes every week. Every Friday, Professor Pat and I will be recapping this show all the way up until the finish line. Be sure to follow Pat with everything he's going on his Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. Be sure to follow myself at everything across platforms at Movie Nerd Reviews. If you're new on Twitch and YouTube, be sure to subscribe to us there. Be sure to also follow our Spotify and Apple podcast feeds where we upload new episodes every Monday and Fridays. And as always, people, seasons in a short film and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next week.